He describes himself as the chief constable of woke, a top cop that has constantly railed against the system, complaining about institutional racism within the Met Police. Neil Basu joins us for an insightful interview about what is really going on with policing in the UK.
So if you want to lead, chief officers have to be much better at making sure that those people don't get into policing in the first place, and if they do, they can't survive in plain sight.
So Neil Basu, we're here to talk about your new book, Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. It's out now. You joined the Met in 1992.
I did.
Feels like a moon ago, doesn't it? And you rose up the ranks to detective superintendent. You're the only officer to have held the top 3 positions in counter-terrorism policing. You led the operational response to the 2017 terror attacks, and then in 2018 succeeded Sir Mark Rowley to become the first Asian to lead the UK's counter-terror policing organisation. That was in the aftermath of the Salisbury poisonings. So I suppose the first question, after 3 decades in the force, is how has policing changed?
Well, policing's changed dramatically. So I think people, particularly people like me who've been retired for a while, often say it was much better in my day and we did things much more. We knew what we were doing on the streets and all of that. I don't believe that for a second. I think I wouldn't have joined policing in the 70s or 80s. I had to think very hard about joining it in the 90s. I think policing in the mid-2020s is probably the best it's ever been. You just wouldn't think that if you read the news.
Do you think we're unduly critical of the police?
I do. And unfortunately I think policing has to be transparent and deserves to be criticised when it gets something wrong. And when it gets something wrong, it often has huge consequences for the public, and it needs to be discussed and it needs to be unpicked. But alongside that, the things it does incredibly well need to be examined and celebrated, because policing is probably the most important public institution you've got. Without it, you're just not safe and you won't feel safe. And unfortunately, the last 5 years, largely brought about by incredibly bad policing, the media coverage of policing has fallen off a cliff. And people like me get maybe 2, 3, if I'm really lucky, 5 minutes. So thank you for inviting me on this to try and bring some balance to that conversation. And of course, I've been one of policing's biggest critics, particularly about race and policing. So I know I've contributed to that as well, but I like to think I can deliver it in a more balanced way.
You say really bad mistakes over the past 5 years. What are those?
Well, the monstrous attacks by serving police officers on women. So certainly, and I don't like using their names, but they were serving police officers in the Metropolitan Police. So Wayne Couzens' murder of Sarah Everard and David Carrick as a serial rapist, and I won't repeat their names again, are probably the 2 worst examples in modern history of 2 individuals bringing policing and its entire reputation to the floor.
But isn't that sort of the point about the media's coverage, whether you blame the media or not? The very fact that those people exist and were able to exist, some would say in plain sight in the Met Police, completely destroys public trust. So it's understandable that people believe that the police is not for them.
I think that's a completely valid argument. I think the problem with policing is it's one of those professions where you tend to catastrophize whatever the incident is. These two particular horrific stories don't need catastrophizing. They are catastrophes for the family, for all of their friends, and for everyone connected. But we also tend to globalize. So we tend to then see every police officer as potentially having that as part of their character. I mean, I work with thousands of police officers over my 30 years. That's just not true. So what I'd like chiefs to recognize is that, what I'm saying is there are far fewer bad police officers, particularly at that monstrous end. There are far fewer bad police officers than the media would have the public believe. Trouble is, there are far more than I think chief officers are willing to admit or to recognize, and that's the big problem. So if you want to lead, chief officers have to be much better at making sure that those people don't get into policing in the first place, and if they do, they can't survive in plain sight.
Just on that note, has something changed with the recruitment of officers? There's been quite a lot of criticism in the last decade or so. The scaling down of Hendon as a training centre, the lower criteria of entry into the police force. I think the Telegraph even did a report questioning whether some police officers coming in now are actually literate, which does seem to be a step change from the professionalisation of the police force and people coming in with degrees and all the rest of it that we witnessed during your tenure.
Yeah, I mean, when I joined, I did have a degree when I joined, and I was a rare beast. Now because of changes in education in the United Kingdom, most people have a degree. I don't think the literacy thing is uncommon to all organisations, as an employer. But I would say that the standard of educational attainment and capability of young people joining today is as high as it's ever been. I don't think that's the issue at all. I think you raise a very valid point about the diminution of Hendon as a training centre. There was something very good about recognising a number of things, really: the camaraderie, the teamwork, the way that 20 weeks of residential training was able to look very forensically at the character of an individual, both in the team and by instructors, and that has been lost with modern training techniques being it's very much university-based, it's classroom-based, it's non-residential. People go home, they don't socialise as much afterwards, and I think something has been lost. But the idea was we were trying not to infantilise a new generation of police officers. I mean, I was nearly 25 when I joined, and being, marching round Hendon Square, being square bashed by an ex-regimental sergeant major was, when I'd already had 2 careers and was engaged, seemed a slightly infantilizing thing to do. Having said that, I really enjoyed the teamwork, and many of my team were at my retirement due 30 years later, which says something about the friendships you build up.
Does it mean that you've slightly lost? Understand your point about the higher levels of education, more degree level people now in the police. But don't you lose something about what might be described as the copper's nose? That idea that being on the street, it's about learning the job on the job has been lost, and that the police now seem to many of the public to be part of an establishment that seems quite distant from them. And they just don't have that connection that may have come from far more non-graduates being in the police service.
Well, that's a very long debate. I think you're right about losing the connection with the public we serve. That definitely happens, and it happens to police officers regardless of their educational level over their service. We do get very institutionalised, we do get brutalised by the job, you get desensitised. You do start seeing a sort of them and us about civilians and policing. This doesn't happen to everyone, but it is a potential. So it's my point about, we can both recruit bullies, but we can make them during the course of their service by distancing themselves from the public. But that started happening in the 60s when we jumped in cars and we got decent radios. And, that lack of connection with the public is a big problem. And that's why you hear so much about neighbourhood policing and the reform to that as a sector of policing being so important. Because a large part of the trust and confidence comes in your interaction with a police officer. You don't get that if they're going past you with blue lights on at 100 miles an hour. You get that if they're embedded in your community. And we've lost that.
Would you like to see more police officers on the street? Is that good for solving crime and good community relations?
Do you know what? It's not particularly good for solving crime, and most criminologists would tell you that. But it definitely has an effect. And it has an effect principally because they are the route to trust and confidence from the public. And if you have a public that trusts you and is confident in you, they're more likely to give you intelligence, which is going to solve crime. They're more likely to tell you what's going on in the neighbourhood and who are the people you should be looking at. They're more likely to obey the law. And they'll certainly be more cooperative victims and witnesses in the criminal justice process. All of those things help. And when I've been a member of street or core policing, and I've also been a member of specialist functions all of my career. And the specialist functions who get the big arrests and the big cases and they put them away, they're not actually the people who generate the most confidence. The most confidence are the cops you see giving you a smile and seeing you every day on your streets. And that's where it's most valuable, rather than thinking it's somehow going to turn crime downwards. I mean, good prevention turns crime downwards. And you could argue an officer in, highly visible on every street corner would help, but they'd have to be on every street corner. That's not going to happen.
Is it better for the police to be loved or feared? I ask this because there's been a debate in recent years about whether it's a force or a service. I would say, speaking personally, that I grew up in fear of the police and getting in trouble with the police. And yet these days, there is a sense to which the Gen Zs sort of don't take the police seriously enough, I would say.
Again, this is one of those urban myths. Youth never liked policing, particularly when I was a university student and a school student. The youth were not particularly enamoured by policing. It is one of those huge figures of authority. Just like the teachers were, just like politicians were, just like lawyers are. And that whole deference to authority has been collapsing for at least 40 years. I mean, we're probably seeing it at pretty much close to its nadir now, not just for policing. So I think getting the youth vote back is incredibly important, and you don't do that by fear. You don't get people's trust and respect by fear. You mentioned Robert Peel at the start of this podcast, and effectively Robert Peel is the person who recognised that. He studied police forces who used force in order to effectively bring control to society, and he decided that was not what the United Kingdom should have. They should have a police force that policed by consent, and that would be based on trust and confidence. And he went further. He said the more force you use, the more consent you will lose, and losing that consent will prevent you being an effective police force. I think he's right. I think most sensible police officers think he's right. Certainly most of my generation thought the policing by consent model was the right way to go. And I wouldn't necessarily describe it as love, but I would describe it as respect, and I certainly wouldn't describe it as fear.
Do you think young people do respect the police these days? Sometimes you see things on social media, again, it could just be a tiny snapshot. You know, the police are trying to detain a criminal in a busy high street. You've got kids filming it on their phones, laughing, at times collaborating with the criminal to allow them to get away. There's a sense sometimes to which perhaps criminals are running rings around the police, particularly young sort of gang members and hoodlums, if I can use that very old-fashioned term. Come on.
It's the 1950s,
I certainly
always
haven't
in the
heard
daily
that
Because
expression.
you've mentioned Peel, I think.
I'm not even sure. I think that may predate 19th century.
Possibly.
The basic question is, do we have the confidence and trust of young people? I hate generalizing. You know, when we use community, you know, people make this mistake when we talk about the black community. You know, we have all kinds of varying confidence from the black community, for instance. It's particularly low amongst young Afro-Caribbean males. So if you segment, you will always get to a point where there is a part of society that has less trust and confidence in us, and we have to work much harder. What I would agree is one of the places we haven't worked hard enough is in the young population in general. So, you know, I would like to see more young people on independent advisory groups. I would like to see policing being brought before the youth parliament. I would like to see us answering questions from young people on how we police them. And in fact, the Commissioner's just done a review of stop and search, which is probably the most iconic tool that policing uses that causes us a barrier and antagonism from the young community, particularly the young black community. And he's just used a sort of an 8,500 person, in-depth study to change the way they do stop and search. And that's precisely the right thing to be doing. More chiefs should be doing exactly the same thing.
Do you think there should be more stop and search too?
No, I think I've always been an outspoken critic of stop and search, not least because I must be one of the very few chief constables or chief constable equivalents in history who has been stop and searched as both a kid, an adolescent, and an adult, including at every airport I go through. And I think people underestimate the effect that it has on you being stopped and searched, even if you're a practicing police officer. And I've been stopped and searched recently as a non-police officer these days. The feeling's pretty much the same. It's definitely how you do it, not what you do it, but it's also where and why. And stop and search has been used very ineffectively as a blanket approach to what I call street suppression. If it's used forensically, in the right way, in the right areas against the right people, it's an incredibly important tool. If you keep misusing it, and various times in our history, politicians have talked about taking away the power for policing, that would be a huge mistake as well. But it's got to be used more effectively. I mean, the Commissioner's recognised that, otherwise he wouldn't have changed.
Would you be able to give us any more details of the stop and search you just went through? What happened, and why did they stop and search you, and what did you say to them?
Well, at an airport, they've got every right to sort of pick people and stop and search them as they see fit. So I would say probably the way I look post 9/11 has been one of the drivers for that. One of my best friends is a 6'3" red-headed Irishman, and we used to trade notes about how many times the two of us had been stopped and searched in an airport. What's quite embarrassing about that is I used to set the rules for targeting stop and search at airports as the head of counter-terrorism, so it's slightly ironic. But if you get stopped and searched, or your bags are searched, and you are swabbed for bomb residue, and that happens regularly, you kind of think there must be something to that. I'm very familiar with behavioral detection and what that means, and suspicious behavior and suspicious activity. I wouldn't think someone with my background is acting particularly suspiciously in an airport.
Although, I mean, the people stopping and searching don't necessarily know your background history. Who would you suggest that people at airports would more aggressively stop and search in the aftermath, for instance, of 9/11?
People where there's an intelligence report on that person, or people behaving suspiciously. I think one of the worst things you can do is stereotype. We had this debate in counterterrorism. Clearly, there is, 80% of the terrorist threat, and that's still true today, has been Salafist, Islamist, jihadist terrorism. And that does tend to be dominated by young Asian men. So there is no doubt whatsoever that some measure of that has to be used as part of your grounds for suspicion. It's just the fact because of the prevalence of that particular crime. I'm not saying that isn't part of it, hence I set some rules-based targeting, but it also depends on intelligence, what flights you're using, how you're behaving, where you're going to and from, and whether or not we have any prior intelligence. That is a much more intelligent way of doing it other than randomly. But there is something about doing random checks which puts people who might be doing reconnaissance on alert, because they'll never know if they'll be chosen or not. I've certainly never complained about it. And last time I spoke about this publicly, I got a call from one of my old colleagues in the Met saying, "Do you want to make a public complaint?" Which did make me laugh. No, of course I don't. What I am saying is, and the Commissioner's clearly recognised it, otherwise he wouldn't be changing the way stop and search is done, is that the way you do it, where you do it, how you do it, why you're doing it, and how you're explaining it to the public are incredibly important if you want to keep that tactic. And we've not always been good at that.
Say if you look at stop and search on the streets of London, what about the claim that as incidents of stop and search have gone down, knife crime seems to have gone up? Is there anything to that relationship?
I think it's entirely possible if that causal effect is happening because in areas where knife crime is a particular problem, stop and search has gone down. And that wasn't my experience of my time on the management board of the Met, where stop and search was increasing dramatically, particularly using violence suppression units targeted on areas of high knife crime. So that doesn't seem to be the causal relationship that seems to be borne out. I mean, what part of the problem is, and this is my point about where are you doing it and why are you doing it? If you're concentrating on areas where you know there are high incidences of knife crime or high incidents of drug activity, that's precisely what you should be doing. You should be doing that with the support of the community who lives there, who are probably incredibly scared because of that kind of behavior on their streets and would probably give you that support. And you should still be doing it, obviously, in a lawful, proportionate and reasonable way with all the legal safeguards that go into it. That was what we were trying to do, I think, under Commissioner Cressida Dick. I think it's what Mark Rowley has been trying to do. In fact, he's been trying to get even more forensic, using data analysis to do precisely that. That might lead to overall numbers of stop and search coming down because you're not doing it in areas where you don't need to be doing it. And it's precisely that kind of activity, the blanket overuse of the tool, that has brought it into disrepute.
Can we talk a bit about knife crime? Many families affected by it, and particularly black families, are crying out for what they would consider to be firmer action from the police. And there's some criticism that the police are too worried about what might be described as community relations to really go into communities and to sort out knife crime where it is, in the majority, a problem involving and affecting young black men.
Yeah, well, I made my name as a detective on a unit called Operation Trident, which was set up in the late 90s. And that was set up dealing with black-on-black crime, as it was. It's now seen as a clumsy title, but at the start in 1998, it was about the murder of a woman in front of her children by a black gang. And that black woman and her children were the genesis of Trident. It came just before the publication of the Macpherson Report in 1999. It was very clear that we had to do something. And my point about this is it's very analogous to knife crime in the black community today, where young black boys are, generally speaking, both the victim and the perpetrator of the crime. It was exactly the same for Operation Trident with gun-related crime in the late 90s and early noughties. And what was so very fundamentally different about that time was some very brilliant people. I stood on the shoulders of the giants who set up Operation Trident. and they recognised they needed to work with the black community. So you can't go in and police using covert measures and using forceful techniques if the black community doesn't understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and is supporting you. And you'll find some of the biggest critics of policing in those days, people who were, effectively grew up like I did in the 70s and 80s with a lot of racism and a lot of police brutality, wanted to help the police during that time. I benefited from it as a murder squad SIO, investigating multiple gangland. I'm not going to use hoodlum, I'm going to use gangster. So multiple gangland homicides. And the reason I was able to solve those was because the black community helped me do it. Now, they didn't help me because they were scared of me. They helped me because they thought we were there to help them solve a problem in their midst. That is what needs to happen now if we want to solve knife crime. And I think some of the attitude that you're describing is people who think, oh, you're very soft on crime and you're letting people off with a caution when they're carrying a knife. And that wasn't my experience of the people running knife crime in London while I was on the management board. It was pretty hard-edged. There was a lot of stop and search. There was a lot of pressure back from communities that we were hard-edged about it. But there was also some support, and that support normally comes, obviously, from bereaved families who would have anything to have their loved one back.
Has that been lost a bit since you've retired, do you think? That hard edge that we need, which Operation Trident proved we needed?
I don't think so. I mean, you'd have to ask the commissioner. I mean, I've been out of frontline policing for nearly 3 years. So, but it's certainly the objective of reducing serious violent crime in London has always been at the top of the mayor's priorities. It's always been at the top of every commissioner's priority since I was in Ian Blair's office in 2008. So that hasn't changed. I think what has changed is the resourcing of policing, where it's vastly underfunded for what it needs to do and vastly over-prioritised with a very high public expectation. You might argue it's been the same since Robert Peel invented it in 1829, but the last 14 years of austerity, just like other public services that policing relies on to help keep people safe, have all been cut to the quick. We're seeing some of the effect of that, I think.
On knife crime, was it ever thus that you had teenagers sort of wielding machetes and other zombie knives, or is that a more latter-day invention? And it could just be that this is more on the public consciousness because we are seeing videos, whereas in the 1980s and so on, we didn't. And therefore, we're seeing this crime sort of playing out on our social media channels, which is quite a unique development.
That's a really good point. So I could take up your entire podcast about the effect of social media as a mechanism for spreading both terror and fear in communities. Yeah. I will tell you that a lot of young people are carrying knives not because they want to be perpetrators, but because they're terrified of their own safety. That's not good. The reason they're terrified is 24/7, 365 days a year, they can access that stuff and look at it, and they really are looking at it. So that has created a dramatic problem, as has the sale and collection of these unbelievable weapons, which could only possibly have ever been developed to kill things.
Yes.
And I think all of the campaigns, particularly impressed with Idris Elba, because you have to have someone of that kind of stature saying things out loud for people to take any notice. I mean, we've been talking about this for decades, but Idris Elba puts it on the front page of every newspaper and then every news channel to say, why aren't we banning these things? Why is it legal to sell them? That is a new phenomenon. I mean, you could go back and study violent gang crime for as long as you like. You'll find 50s teddy boys using flick knives and beating each other up in the streets. You wouldn't have heard much about it, or if you did, it would be one page of a news story and that would be chip paper the next day. Now it'll be there forever, and the images of it will be rolling on your media feed constantly. And I think that perception of the fear of it is very, very high.
When it comes to chip paper stories, can we just ask you about something that has been on the front pages of the newspapers this week? It's this story, and you spoke earlier about how the police should be policing with consent. It's this story about these 6 officers from Hertfordshire Police.
I wondered when this would come up.
Turning up at the door of parents who had made complaints about their daughter's school on WhatsApp, and indeed sent letters, I believe, to the board of governors and the head teacher. Now, if you look at footage of that, and these officers sort of approaching the house from all angles, a terraced house in Boreham Wood, it seems rather disproportionate. And the complaint, of course, particularly in Hertfordshire, which is funny enough where I live, on the local radio. People were complaining, why was there this overzealous policing, basically, of people's thoughts on WhatsApp? When I've phoned the police to report a burglary, nobody's turned out. When my shop has been raided by thieves, nobody's turned out. I lost a bike, the police couldn't be bothered to investigate it. These sorts of stories, I appreciate they might be few and far between. They do erode faith in police, don't they?
Thank you for saying they're few and far between. But I would say that I go to dinner parties and some of my friends and their friends will tell me policing were awful, and some of them will tell me I've just had an experience with policing and they were magic. So that's the trouble with balance. You're absolutely right. Individual examples like that and the way they're portrayed are going to be damaging confidence. And I think, people are right to say there's been a lot of, this is hilarious coming from me because I had a reputation of being the super woke so-called head of counterterrorism. But there has been an overzealous attitude towards some of what I would call, not in this instance, but hate crime and the way it's recorded and the way it's delivered. The previous Conservative administration tried to tighten up the rules on how it was recorded and what we did about it. I think people are forgetting where it all came from. Partly it comes from the appalling racist murder of Stephen Lawrence and the bodged investigation and our need to start getting trust and confidence in the black community back and recording hate crime better and doing something about it to give justice to people. It also came much later on from a very famous case in Leicestershire of a woman who killed herself after having murdered her daughter, having been subjected to months and months of appalling abuse and harassment, which might be seen as antisocial behaviour now, but was simply ignored back then. And if all of those incidents had been recorded and the pattern of behaviour was seen, perhaps something could have been done earlier. Now, all of that is a country mile away from 6 large police officers turning up at your front door in the home counties because you said something on WhatsApp. But, that doesn't look good. That is going to give it the wrong impression, and it's going to give a lot of ammunition to the kind of people who think, typical police officers wasting their time when they should be doing something important.
This takes us into the area of non-crime hate incidents. You know that our economist Alison Pearson initially believed she was being accused of a non-crime hate incident. Actually, when the details became clearer, it was a slightly different operation that Essex police were involved in. But it all came down to a tweet that she could not even remember. And there's been a big debate about non-crime hate incidents since then.
Huge. Yeah.
I can hear what you're saying. Camilla, you and I have discussed this, that this might have come from a good place, i.e., as you say, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, domestic abuse cases, etc., etc. But surely it is now time, given how non-crime hate incidents are now being used for journalists, columnists on national newspapers about tweets. It's gone too far. Surely it's the time to stop non-crime hate incidents.
Yeah, I think if there was ever a time not to be overzealous and make a mistake, it would be with a national journalist. So that really doesn't help. And I think the debate is one that should be had. And there's a brilliant, if you've read it, Theresa May's book, I think it was called Absolute Power. There's a great line in there about policing. He says, I could never get policing to do anything proportionately. They're always at one end of the spectrum. If you tell them to do X, they'll always do X plus. Tell them to do Y, they'll do Y plus, And I think there is a big problem in trying to get 135,000 police officers to do something in a standard way. Now, during the implementation of things like non-crime hate incident policy, and I sat on the College of Policing board that writes that kind of authorised professional practice and policy, you will get plenty of police officers, even if it's only a fraction of 1%, taking that too far and making mistakes. And if it is such a high-profile case as it was with Alison, that is going to cause tremendous problems. And you said it before, this is my point about globalization. You start thinking that every police officer thinks like that, and every police officer would have made that decision. That's just not the case. There's a lot of discretion.
But just to be clear, you're saying review, but not abandon.
Cease. No, I think ceasing it would be a terribly retrograde step. And anyone who has got a protected characteristic who's been abused publicly or privately because of it, and then doesn't have that treated seriously, that it's not recorded when they say they've been a victim, and then it's not investigated, which is what used to happen before this policy came in, pre the Macpherson report, would be horrified if we suddenly stopped doing anything about it at all. But of course, there are levels. And sometimes police officers make mistakes. Sometimes they're overzealous. Sometimes they're motivated by their own personal need to be seen as the person who's helping that particular cause. Of course they make mistakes. They're human beings. You have to look behind the badge. Part of the reason for the book was we all think we know policing really well. We all think we know police officers really well. I think I counted the other night, I'm in a hotel room, I'm flicking channels, 8 out of 9 programs were crime related. I mean, people love it and they think they know what's behind the badge. Try doing it for 30 years. You don't. It's really easy to make mistakes. It's really, really hard to do the right thing well all of the time.
Neil, we want to get on to asking you about your work in counter-terrorism. Before we do that, I just wanted to pick up on something you said about you being woke. There's quite a lot of quotes associated with you being woke.
Oh,
You said at one point,
tremendous number.
"Are you alert to issues of racial and social justice?" Yes, I am. And if that is the definition of woke, I'll wear it as a bumper sticker every day of the week.
I wish I'd said it as passionately as you did
Well,
then.
I'm just hoping to recreate the magic of the
Yeah,
original
I think that was
quote.
to Kathy, wasn't it, on Channel 4?
To Kathy Newman.
I do absolutely feel that way because I feel the entire term has been taken over by the culture war and misused. So it was originally developed in the 30s. It's part of the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. It was largely because Black people were being asked to recognize that they were being, in my profession, would be over-policed and underprotected. So wake up, be alert to the fact that social and racial justice are things you should stand up for. Of course I'm behind that. I mean,
Okay.
I happen to think that if you're any police officer who carries a badge ought to be behind that too. But that's not what woke means today to anybody. It has been completely bastardized.
All right. But you have been criticised in the past for being a bit too political. For instance, your criticism of former Home Secretary Suella Braverman. You likened her comments on immigration to Enoch Powell's famous Rivers of Blood speech. You said her language was inexplicable and horrific. You've also been very critical of another former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, on her accusation that such a thing as two-tier policing exists.
Yeah, and I stand by both of those comments. The advantage I had then, of course, is I wasn't a serving assistant commissioner.
So you're able to say it afterwards, but you felt it at the time.
I think the party that stands up most for free speech is the Conservatives. So I think they'd be perfectly fine with me exercising my free speech to make that comment.
But do you think one of the reasons, I mean, you retired, and we're going to get on to asking you what you're going to do next, but did you become a bit too political and a bit too outspoken? Even if you made these comments afterwards,
When
you
I
were
was
wearing when you were working, you were sort of like wearing your wokery literally as a bumper sticker
my
or
heart on my sleeve.
or a badge of honour, perhaps.
It's certainly a badge of honour. I mean, the book's called Turmoil because I joined a profession that most people saw as racist and corrupt in the early 90s. And it's been quite a difficult thing to be a part of that profession and to love it so much. This is a love letter to policing. I describe it's from an angry lover because I don't think we've done enough to turn the dial. And I think that's obvious. You only have to look at every report. I can go back to McPherson because that was so, key to my formative years as a police officer. But you could go back to Dame Louise's Casey's report in 2023 and find the same thing. So the turmoil is, are you willing to just stand there and fit in and take it, or should you have done something about it or said something about it? I mentor an awful lot of Black, Asian and female officers, all of whom feel like this, none of which should be put in a position where they have to stand up and say something out loud. I mean, it's unfair to put everyone in that position. It's probably not unfair when you've reached the rank of assistant commissioner and you have a very high platform and you have a voice that people listen to and that you have an opportunity that you should say something about racial and social injustice. And that's what I was trying to do. I disliked the fact that trying to create an anti-racist police force, trying to create an anti-racist counter-terrorism force across the country was considered to be a political act. I don't consider anti-racism political. I think it's something we should be doing, and particularly if your job is to police everybody.
Reading into your career before this interview, one quote, just building on what Camilla has said, is that you were too woke for the top job. Do you think that was true in the end, that you were seen as too much trouble politically to get the commissioner's job?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, there were political lobby briefings to that very point, and plenty of, broadsheet and and tabloid headlines to that effect. So almost certainly that was true.
Did you get on well with Cressida Dick? Do you
Very.
think she was unfairly treated in the end?
Yes. So I think Cressida's my oldest mentor and ally in policing. I've known her since 2003. You'll read in the book how we met on a peace march in Halsden when I was a murder squad SIO for Trident and she was the commander in charge of it. I'd have walked on hot coals for her from that day forward, and I frequently did. So yes, she was an ally. Did I think she was well treated in the end? It was a bit like Ian Blair. At the time when the Met figures, all the things that you were being assessed against were going in the right direction, you still get fired. And
But
that
why?
seems,
Internal police forces? Internal police politics, actual politics, Home Secretaries and others making decisions above the heads of
I
the
think
people in the force?
there's a lot of politics and a lot of media in it, hence the working title of the book. So there is no doubt that you've heard of Napoleon Bonaparte's famous sort of saying about "I like lucky generals." There's lots of senior leaders who get taken down by a series of unfortunate events. I think both of the leaders I've described fell victim to a series of unfortunate events where their time became probably untenable in the eyes of politicians and the press. In other words, a head has to roll.
Mark Rowley came in after Cressida Dick saying that he was going to clean up the force and get rid of lots of people who had basically been on long-term sick or long-term investigations, still being paid by the force for year after year after year. Since then, a lot of his critics have said he simply hasn't managed to do what he said he would do day one, and the officers have not been pushed out of the force, the bad apples, so to speak. Do you think that he has achieved what he said he was going to achieve on day one? Which was clean up the force of the types of people you were describing at the beginning of the podcast,
Yeah.
particularly around the hatred and disgraceful treatment of women.
I think he's trying incredibly hard to do that. So I think probably not since Robert Mark in the early 70s with Operation Countryman, probably not since Paul Condon with CIB in the sort of early 90s, and I worked on that unit in the noughties, the anti-corruption command of the Met. I think those were the two former commissioners who came in with the same bullish attitude towards improving professionalism and professional standards. Has he done enough? No, but I think he would tell you that. Has he been able to do enough? No, and he would definitely tell you that because he said it very publicly. He doesn't have the tools because of police regulations and the law to do what he said he would do. I think he thought he would get that help quicker. I think he's going to get that help. I think the regulation and the law are going to be changed so he's much more capable of getting rid of these appalling police officers. And by the way, I think this is where I fall out with some of my fellow chiefs. I think and I've been leading teams since I was 11 years old, if I count my first cricket team, and I did lose that first match, still stings. Probably about 20% of every team is lazy, incompetent, corrupt, or prejudiced. Sometimes all four of those things. If you're a leader, you're a supervisor, you think you are in charge, you should be trying to motivate or inspire the lazy and the incompetent. You can retrain them, you can motivate and inspire them. My friends in the private sector say we'd just sack them, that's a waste of leadership effort. But the corrupt and the prejudiced, you should have a zero tolerance attitude for. Once you have proved on the balance of probabilities that these people are corrupt or prejudiced, they should be fired. Lots of things prevent him from just making that clinical decision. The process, the effectively quasi-judicial process that he is involved in has made that very difficult. But he has certainly reinforced professional standards. He's put more officers into professional standards. He took them out of our old alma mater in counter-terrorism to do that. These are some of the best detectives the Met has. Paul Condon did the same thing in the 90s. Some of the senior leaders he put into professional standards are some of the finest police officers I've ever worked with in my life. So is he trying? He's trying really hard. I think he's proving how difficult it is and how resistant the culture is to change.
Neil, let's move on to talking about your leadership in counter-terrorism. Looking from the outside in, I would imagine dealing with atrocities like 7/7, the London Bridge attack, Westminster, Manchester Arena bombing. These must be such difficult cases to not only deal with just as an officer on ground level, but actually to be in charge of the team trying to get to the root of what's happened.
Yeah, I didn't deal with 7/7. I was on Operation Trident dealing with gangland murder at the time. but 7/7 was a huge wake-up call for London. And when 2017 happened, that was probably the longest period of sustained threat this country's faced since the height of the IRA troubles. And I didn't say that. Andrew Parker, who was the head of MI5 at the time, said it. So it was incredibly difficult. And I used to say, I was Mark Relly's deputy at that time, and I used to say my job description is 4 pages long, but I can crystallize it in one sentence: work with MI5 and stop terrorist attacks. And if you don't stop them, you can't think about that but as a failure every single day. During the same time we were there, we stopped 29 attacks. We arrested over 600 terrorists. Never happened before in our history. We charged most of them. I never thought about that for a single day. I only thought about it when I was writing this book. What I always thought about was the dead and the bereaved, and the 36 people who died in 2017 on my watch, including 2 police officers, and the over 1,000 people who were physically and psychologically scarred for life. And you go to bed every night thinking about that. Now, if it was that difficult for me as the head of counter-terrorism policing, imagine what it's like for first responders, day in, day out, year after year, earlys, lates and nights, dealing with equally brutal and horrifying circumstances. But I watched people go to pieces during that time. It was incredibly difficult. It made us all much more aware of how important the mental health and well-being of police officers is, I think.
Do you think that there is still the same threat from Islamic extremists as there was almost a decade ago?
Oh, I know. I know there is. So I'm not privy to any sensitive briefing, but my professional experience would tell me that the same volume of threat is still there. Is it increasing? It probably wasn't until October the 7th. So I think the Iranians and their proxy Hamas did a very good job of preventing any kind of peace initiative in the Middle East. And I think the response to it has been so overwhelming, a bit like 9/11, that it has created a whole new generation of radicalized extremists who will be prepared to attack. I'm afraid my successes in counter-terrorism policing will be very busy for a very long time to come. And of course, what goes with that threat is its horrible counterpart, the extreme right-wing threat, which is also growing.
One of the reactions to the October the 7th atrocity has been marches in London. There's been lots of complaints, particularly from Jewish people living in London, that they are intimidatory, that the police have not been strong enough on policing those marches, that they are allowed to happen with monotonous regularity, meaning that many people feel unsafe in central London around the marches. Do you think the Met Police have been strong enough in how they've policed those demonstrations?
You know, I'm on record having talked about the police demonstration. I thought Mark Relly did a fantastic job policing those demonstrations. It's typical of being a commissioner in the Metropolitan Police that public order is the one thing that's guaranteed to put you on the front page of every newspaper and potentially cost you your job. And of course, like all policing of public order, when you say, have they been strong enough? My history of 30 years in the police is when the police are strong, they're talked about as though they were fascist. And when they are weak, they are talked about as two-tier policing. That's part of the argument for two-tier policing is we're weak on minorities, black community, BLM, but we're very strong on far-right protests. We're very weak on Palestinian, but we'd be very strong on the EDL. None of that is true. I know all the senior public order commanders in the Met. I know how they try and police. I've known the 30-year history of policing public order, which 20 years ago became what we call community-based public order policing, where we recognise that people have the right to protest as long as they do it lawfully and peacefully. They're 2 really important words. I do think at one point we may have lost track of lawfully, but I think the whole criminal justice system has. So one of the problems the Met has, and every chief constable around the country, is that you have to allow a certain amount of unlawful activity before they breach a threshold. So you have to allow a certain amount of disruption, a certain amount of obstruction. People are not going to get convicted for a minor disruption or a minor obstruction. What's happened with the Palestinian protests is they've happened for so long at such weight that they have now tipped that threshold into too disruptive, too obstructive, and therefore the police has had to react harder to that. The day they did, I could have written the headline for you. Look at the police, heavy-handed. If you're on the left, they're heavy-handed now. If you're on the right, we should have been even more brutal. It's called the thin blue line for a reason, You stand between two warring parties and you're trying to keep the peace. And unfortunately, policing will never get the right kind of coverage for that incredibly difficult thing. Tom Windsor called it the brain surgery of policing. As a detective, I disagree with him, but it is incredibly complicated and incredibly difficult.
Has there been too much fear among the police, though, of alienating particularly the Muslim community? If we look at the Pakistani rape gangs, one criticism that was made of the forces involved, if we look particularly in northern towns, it was a degree of squeamishness, not wanting to upset community relations. We interviewed a grooming survivor actually on the Daily Tea who said the police at the time were completely au fait with what was going on, didn't want to step in, didn't want to appear racist.
Well, I think that's also an example of appalling policing. So if I take the political correctness argument to one side for a moment, it was just an example of appalling policing. It wasn't just about racism. It was failing to treat white working class girls who were incredibly vulnerable as serious victims of horrific crimes. So that is just very bad policing. The political correctness argument is also true. And I don't think it was just the police. I think every agency looked at the issue through the lens of will be seen as racist, will be called out for being racist. And I think I think everyone recognises now what a fundamental mistake that was, particularly for those victims. So, our thoughts should be with them and what happened to them, and they'll be living with it for the rest of their lives. That is my example of political correctness gone mad, woke, being not the kind of woke I agree with at all, taking it to an extreme degree. But it is also an example of something incredibly important, which I think is fear in policing, that if you lose control of the streets, you're going to lose your job. If you don't have the trust and confidence of a community and you do something that is seen by that community as wrong, and the most extreme example of this is when a young black man dies in police custody. Every senior police officer is sitting on the edge of their seats thinking there is going to be a protest followed by a riot. And we have seen that in the past. And that's because the immediate assumption of that community is not the benefit of the doubt, wait for the investigation, it's the police brutality or police murdered their loved one. Now, I think there's been a lot of fear in the way we've policed minority communities, thinking the result will be that. And that's coupled with the fear that they won't cooperate, we won't get intelligence, they won't want to be victims and, give statements and go to court and be. This is what I was trying to say earlier on, and this is my problem with policing not really understanding race. You need the trust and confidence of communities. That doesn't mean you turn a blind eye to serious crime in those communities. It means you get the trust and confidence of the vast majority of law-abiding members of that community to police with them to stop the problems inside their community. And if you don't have that, you get what we have seen in the past in this country.
But isn't it also officers perhaps living in fear of criticism by people like you who have claimed that the police force is institutionally racist? They've then thought to themselves, I'm a white copper operating in Rochdale. I do not want to be accused of being racist. So actually, when it comes to this quite tricky subject of Pakistani men grooming white working class girls, do you know what? I might sit this one out because I don't want to be criticised by the likes of Neil Basu or anyone else.
I don't think that might be true. So, and I think a large part of that is what I saw as a sergeant in 1999, where we didn't explain institutional racism to the front line of policing. And by the way, we have never tried to explain it since. We've just tried to sweep it under the carpet. And when I left my career, it was largely on the back of chief constables not wanting to admit it again, even though exactly the same conditions exist as existed in 1999. That didn't mean I meant go and blurt it out to 150,000 cops and make them all feel like they're being called racist. And by the way, I think that is massively underestimating the intelligence of our workforce. But of course, you should spend some time and effort explaining what the problem is. And actually, the institutional, that's the one word the Commissioner won't use, but he has used systemic. So he recognises that it isn't just a bunch of individual racists. And there is a systemic problem in policing that is over-policing minority communities. He's recognised that. He's doing something about it. But nobody wants to use that word because particularly police officers of my generation remember what it felt like to have that word used and not for it to be explained to us. So a lot of my colleagues thought they were being called individually racist. I had people say, I'm not a racist now. Don't think I never thought you were, and I've been working with you for years. But that was a feeling, and I think you're right to say if if it is done badly, you could definitely have that effect. I don't think it's as widespread as you think. And one of the main reasons for not accepting it, I think, is that they don't want a backlash from the vast majority of the front line who are white and male. They don't want that backlash. They don't want a backlash from the media that would immediately say this is political correctness gone mad. They don't want, they don't think the black community cares. And that's really wrong. I know they do. You know, they cared about Macpherson. They cared about the definition. They trusted him. They trusted his judgment. And they want policing to admit it again and then move on and do something about it. I think it would have been a one-day story if it was admitted. It's the non-admission that has created this never-ending story. And I admit I am contributing to that. It's the principal reason for writing this book, that if you don't understand the moral case for admitting it, think of the business case. Think of getting the trust and confidence back and how that might help you be more effective in the future. That's the principal purpose of this book.
Given the failings that you've said there were around the lack of investigation into the child rape gangs by the majority of times Pakistani men, do you think now there should be a full national inquiry to learn the lessons, something that the government has said it will not do? It's still sticking with what a lot of critics say a much weaker local inquiry. Should there be a national inquiry to understand some of the points that you have made around political correctness, failure investigations, and failures to take particularly young working class white women's stories seriously?
Short answer is yes. So I think it is a mistake not to have one. I'm conflicted by that though, because certainly public inquiries become elongated, very messy, incredibly expensive. And by the time they deliver any kind of conclusion, you know, it's gone out of people's minds. But Rotherham for me is a bit like Hillsborough. I don't think it will ever go out of people's minds. So until you uncover the actual truth and you lay it bare, it will always be there. So I think for that reason, this is one of those occasions where I think, yes, this really should happen.
Can we talk about the Southport murders? Again, we don't want to repeat this man's name more than once, but do you consider Axel Rudakabana to be a terrorist?
No, and I said that very clearly at the time. So what I consider him to be is a monster who wanted to terrorize. That's very different from being a terrorist. So it's a bit of an arcane point for the public because all they see is a mass atrocity and fear and terror. So they think, well, that's just terrorism, isn't it? Terrorism is a very political crime, and you have to read the full definition in the 2000 Act of the Terrorist Act about what it actually is. But it requires an ideology. It requires a reason for committing the act, which is usually the overthrow of a policy or a government, which is why it's such a political crime. If we go down the lines of looking at everyone who has a reason to, in their own heads to commit violence and make that terrorism, you're going to overwhelm the counter-terrorism machine in this country when they are looking at, a huge volume of actual terrorists who are ideologically driven and determined to kill. I mean, a lot of these cases require a completely different approach using a similar model. So I think Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of counterterrorism legislation, agrees with me that this is not terrorism and has published his report and the review he was asked to do. But I agree with him when he says there needs to be something, there needs to be a system whereby these individuals, once they are spotted, if they are not considered terrorists, are still dealt with in a similar way, but by non-counterterrorism and MI5.
Has Prevent failed?
In total or on this case?
Well, not necessarily on this case, because as you say, he is not considered a terrorist. So Prevent is not there to capture people of this type. Some would argue it should do, but you're making an argument contrary to that. But Camilla and I have reported on many different occasions in the relatively young life of the Daily Tea podcast where somebody who was on Prevent's radar, and you will know what these cases are, went on to murder and maim. And lots of people criticize Prevent as a system and say that it is now failed, it needs to be closed down and something else needs to be restarted. I just wondered where you were on that.
I utterly disagree, and I spent my 6.5 years in counter-terrorism arguing that Prevent was the most important pillar of the government's strategy. I wished at the time that successive administrations had stood up to support their own strategy. I think at the time it was introduced so badly and clumsily and mistakes were made, that it did look exactly as we were being accused of, something that was targeting the Muslim community and was fascistic in its response. And it wasn't and it wasn't supposed to be that at all. I know the person who devised it. At the end of the day, it was a pre-criminal, entirely voluntary system. Whereas if you thought you had a problem, or somebody close to you thought you had a problem, you could be referred into it and get some help and hopefully dissuade you from it. Now, in the time that it's been established, I don't know how many thousands of people have been through the Prevent system, through the full process of Channel. If even 1% of those was dissuaded from becoming a terrorist or committing a terrorist attack, then Prevent has paid for itself many, many times over. Now, does that mean that Prevent is a foolproof system? It's no more foolproof than the entire counter-terrorism machine. We've had terrorist attacks. We will continue to have terrorist attacks. They're much harder to stop and see and stop than they've ever been before. But so is somebody who is potentially being radicalized. It's very hard to know whether or not that person is deceiving you, is lying, or is perfectly helped by you, but in later years decides to go back on that path. All of those things have happened to us, all of them. And it certainly doesn't mean that the system is foolproof. But because a handful of cases have resulted in terrorist attacks, to dismiss an entire strategy that's helped thousands of people would be a fundamental mistake, in my opinion.
How worried are you, though, about the online extremism that young people are exposed to? We've obviously got the case of the Southport murderer, who was downloading all sorts of different things online, from sort of Mein Kampf to Chechenian training manuals to the Al-Qaeda manual and all the rest of it. We've had a huge dialogue, haven't we, about the Netflix series Adolescence, and the premise of that is a young boy basically being radicalised by the incel movement to kill a female classmate. Do you worry about what young people are exposed to, and do you think the government, tech giants and others should be doing more?
The last time I was in the Telegraph offices was in 2020, explaining to your editor what the incel movement was. I said very publicly that COVID would make the situation you've just described worse. This is an I told you so moment. A huge percentage, a really disturbing percentage of counterterrorism cases are early teenagers now. I watched Adolescence over the weekend. It's utterly brilliant, compelling, and totally disturbing. And as a father of three, thought, you'd be terrified as a parent now. It should come with a warning for parents. But it's absolutely true. You asked what I think of the social media and the online experience. 100% of the cases I dealt with in counterterrorism had online, either downloading, radicalizing, use of social media to radicalize others or to be influenced by, 100%. So and I'm beginning to sound like Mary Whitehouse for those people, neither of you are old enough to probably remember.
We both are.
Well, you're doing very well on it. Please don't do counterterrorism. You look as old as me. But the Mary Whitehouse sort of thing at the time was, I remember the arguments against her opinion that, we were seeing far too much violence and that violence was causing people to commit violence. And the attitude was, well, it might cause one or two people to commit violence, but it won't cause the majority, because the majority of people can distinguish between reality and fiction. So we're just not going to do anything about that. And okay, when it was a lot harder to get access to that kind of material, that might have been a compelling argument. Today, the compelling argument is we have no idea the scale and I do, because it was my profession, but the scale, the volume, and the timing of the stuff that our youngsters are seeing is extraordinary. And is having a much more widespread effect. Even my point earlier on about terrorizing youngsters and wanting to protect themselves by arming themselves. But for those who have got problems, and those problems might be grievance or disenfranchisement or mental health, or it just might be that they are, and this is rare in my experience, genuinely evil. This is giving them some methodology and some ways to commit it. And I think until somebody does something about it, we're in terrible trouble. The great thing about things like Adolescence is making everyone think about it and talk about it. It's a bit like Idris Elba earlier on. No one really cares if someone like me stands up and talks about it. I think they care a little bit. That post is very important for saying things like this. But I remember the 6 major technology companies all telling the heads of counterterrorism of the Five Eyes countries that they wouldn't meet us to discuss how they might help us stop this problem. That was way back in 2018. It's only the fact that governments and legislators have got involved things like the Online Safety Act that has made those companies sit up and take notice. It'll only be when advertisers refuse to advertise on those platforms will they really take notice. And the unfortunate thing is they're the only people who can cure it. They're the only people with the budgets big enough and the brains big enough to do something about this.
Given the failures of the tech platforms to act in a way that many of us agree with you on, is it time to ban smartphones for under 16s?
Oh, I would. So I do that in a heartbeat. And I think it's in Hertfordshire. There's a town where the problem is peer pressure. You know, you don't want to send your child to school where everyone's got a smartphone and they haven't. I mean, the bullying and the fear of missing out and the mental health trauma that would come from that, I think every parent in the modern age would recognise. So sending them to a school where no one's allowed that, well, that's got legs. And I can't remember where it is, but I heard that a number of schools in a education area had got together and agreed that with the parents. And
I think there's banning at
brilliant.
schools. There's banning at schools is one thing, big debate. Some schools are doing it. But banning period is another thing. Do you think we need to go that extra step?
It would be incredibly difficult to do. Bear in mind where most of those social media companies are American-based companies with the First Amendment as an absolute...
No, I'm talking about the actual mechanism of delivery. Smartphones for young people should be banned. There's a big debate in politics about that.
Yeah, there is. And I think the trouble is, experiencing what I've experienced, you tend to be a bit extreme. So I would say yes. But I would say that actually having a big debate in Parliament, this is not for police officers or former police officers to make strident comments on. It's a societal issue, and society has to debate these things. And by the way, it's the same with protest that we've just discussed. Society has to debate what level of protest it's prepared to tolerate and then give policing the tools to be able to police it to that degree. This is exactly the same point.
Neil, we're running out of time. Quick question. Why did you not take that top job to be in charge of the government's new border control force?
I advised on the creation of it, so I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. I think Martin Hewitt is a fantastic appointment. The job itself is a bit like my old colleagues, Charles Farr and Tom Hurd, who ran the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism, which was a Whitehall civil servant's job to manage ministers of state and to create a cross-Whitehall response to a significant issue. That's what Martin's doing. It's absolutely the right thing to do. I wasn't interested in doing that. I was interested in being the person who enforces the law and smashes the gangs. So had they been advertising Director General of the National Crime Agency, which I have applied for before, I would have applied for that job.
Ah. And on smashing the gangs, you said you were going to have that cup of tea with Yvette Cooper. What's the first question you'd ask her?
What about that particular issue?
Just about anything.
Well, the boats are coming across in ever greater numbers.
Yeah.
But you might want to ask her about the funding of the police.
They might, but the inability of governments of whatever political hue to control our borders, as many voters see it, it's incredible, the failure, isn't it? And what would you do about that?
Well, I think I'm sitting here today while there's a border security
yet another summit.
global event happening
Yet
at
another
Lancaster House, which originally I thought I was going to be invited to and have a conversation on. So I would say probably exactly what you're saying, that if you one of the biggest causes of right-wing, and I'm talking about extreme right-wing, I'm not talking about right-wing politics or right-wing media, I'm talking about this sentiment, and so we've discussed Southport, is a failure to control immigration or to have any kind of sensible conversation. And I sit here as a son of an immigrant who helped build the National Health Service, incredibly proud of that, incredibly proud of the economic impact and cultural revolution from immigration into the United Kingdom. And I'm very clear that as a non-white person, if I wanted to live in any majority white society, I'd live in the United Kingdom any day of the week. It's got a fantastic history, certainly since the 30s, of rebelling against any of this kind of behaviour in order to prevent the false narrative taking hold that somehow immigration is the problem. You do have to recognise that it's gone too far too fast, and you have to do something about it. Now, I don't really think I have to tell Yvette Cooper that. I think she knows that. I think she knows it very clearly, and she's made some very bold, very strong statements about policing immigration that could easily have come from a Conservative administration. I would ask her to reconsider the National Identification Card scheme that I think David Blunkett tried to introduce under the Blair government and was widely vilified. But if you want to look strong and you want to help law enforcement, that would be the only thing I'd think of that she isn't currently thinking of.
ID cards for everyone.
Yeah. The idea that it's the smart revolution, if you've got a passport, and 80% of this country has a passport, If you've got a driving license, if you've got a bank card, we are used to biometric identification for living our entire lives, not least because you're all sitting here with smartphones. You are used to that, and you give that data away freely. If a government wants to enforce the law and particularly know who's in its country and who's out of its country, it needs that. And I think public sentiment towards that, given that it might be a strong point about border security, would be pro, whereas when David Blunkett tried to introduce it, it was very much antagonistic towards that.
Final question. You mentioned you were a father of 3. Would you encourage any of your children to join the police force today?
Yes. So if I could just say what I almost started with, this is a love letter to policing. I love policing. I worked with thousands of police officers who I have no doubt whatsoever are the very best of us in society. You hear that great cliche all the time. They're always running forward into danger when everyone else is running away. They really are. And by the way, it's complicated because sometimes people you don't want in the police force are still prepared to run into danger on our behalf. So it is more complicated. But the vast majority of people doing that job are tremendous people. And some of them have become my closest friends and always will be. There are very few jobs. I wasn't bright enough to be a doctor or a nurse like my mother and father, but there are very few jobs in public service more rewarding than bringing justice to a victim of crime or keeping peace in communities. Very few that I can think of. I'll never have that purpose again.
Neil Basu, your new book, Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice, is available now. Thank you so much for joining us on the Daily Tea. Thanks for your honesty and for your experience.
Great interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.